Good evening and hello, everyone. Welcome to the panel on COVID-19 and its impact on professional women. We've already had a question in the chat asking if this session will be recorded and available afterwards, and indeed it will be. It will be available on the site of the National Center for the Study of Collective Bargaining in Higher Education and the Professions when they make all the sessions from the conference available. So we're delighted to have you here today. Thank you for coming on in the evening, dinner time, nap time, whatever. We appreciate it. We think it will be well worth your while. My name is Karen Stubis. I'm Vice President for Academic Affairs at Rutgers University in New Jersey, and I'll be your panel moderator this evening. Just to give you a little bit of information about my own background, my career is in 17th century American history, proof that the humanities are alive and well, and that you can have full employment for all of your career with a humanities degree. Academic labor relations is a large part of my portfolio at Rutgers. In addition, I help advance faculty diversity, women's leadership, and working towards sexual harassment prevention and culture change in the academy. So lots of interesting areas. I'm also a member of the Board of Advisors for the National Center for the Study of Collective Bargaining in Higher Education and the Professions. So the central focus of our discussion this evening, as I think you know, will be the recent March 2021 consensus study report of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, whose title is The Impact of COVID-19 on the Careers of Women in Academic Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. The apparent disparate impact of COVID on the productivity of women faculty is an issue that people started talking about and writing about fairly early on in the pandemic. And I pulled just a few titles for you this evening. There are hundreds and hundreds. So for instance, in the Lancet in June of 2020, we had challenges for the female academic during the COVID-19 pandemic. In Journal of the American Medical Association in August, we had consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic on manuscript submissions by women. In April of 2020, in Inside Higher Ed, Colleen Flaherty wrote No Room of One's Own. And my personal favorite appeared in the New York Times in May of 2020. Quote, nearly half of men say they do most of the homeschooling. 3% of women agree. Therein lies part of the rub. So with all the attention, and those are just 4 articles out of hundreds, the National Academies decided that this was something that bore looking into, which led to the eventual publication of the consensus study report, which was issued in March of this year. We are really very honored to have 3 of the authors of that report with us this evening, as well as Julie Wade, who's college dean at UConn, to comment on the report. So we have a great lineup. So let's get started on it. So from the National Academies, we have Maria Lund-Dahlberg, who you can see her name there. There's Maria. Maria and Dr. Eve Higginbottom and Leslie Gonzalez. So first for Maria. Maria served as a report study director and co-editor. She's a senior program officer at the National Academies, whose work, in addition to the Women in COVID project, also includes, wait till you hear this list, equity and identity in science, science communications, the research experiences of postdocs, effective mentoring in STEM, innovation ecosystems, and faculty tenure and promotion. But I have to say that every time I talk to Maria, she's talking about another new project that's totally exciting to me that is coming up on her docket. So I'm sure this is a very incomplete list. And Maria's disciplinary area is physics. Next, we have very different from 17th century American history, must be said. Next, we have Dr. Eve Higginbotham, who's chair of the Committee on the Impacts of COVID-19 on the Careers of Women in Academic Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and is one of the authors of the report and co-editor. Eve is also inaugural Vice Dean for Inclusion and Diversity at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, as well as a senior fellow at the Leonard Davis Institute for Health Economics and professor of ophthalmology at Penn. And finally, Dr. Higginbotham has been a member of the National Academy of Medicine since the year 2000. We are also joined this evening by Professor Leslie Gonzalez, Associate Professor in the Higher Adult and Lifelong Learning Unit in the College of Education at Michigan State University. Leslie is also an affiliate faculty member in the Center for Gender in a Global Context and also in Chicano Latinx Studies at Michigan State. In addition, Leslie is co-PI of Aspire, which is a multi-million-dollar project funded by the National Science Foundation, whose goal is to diversify STEM faculty and promote more inclusive teaching practices. And as I was scrolling through lists of articles about women and the COVID pandemic and their productivity, I came across more than one from Leslie. So thank you, Leslie. Leslie is also a member of the National Academy's Committee on the Impacts of COVID-19 and Women and one of the authors of the study. Finally, I am very pleased to welcome my old friend and colleague from the Big Ten Academic Alliance, Dr. Julie Wade. Julie has been serving as Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the University of Connecticut since July of 2019, which means that she had maybe 8 months before COVID hit. So like plenty of time, Julie. Her college at UConn Arts and Sciences is UConn's largest, with over 9,800 undergraduates, 1,700 graduate students, and over 750 faculty members. I think, Julie, it's more like 800 these days, right? It's close to 800. Before going to UConn, from 1995 onward, Dr. Wade was a faculty member at Michigan State University. So somehow Michigan State has packed the room here, right? So I don't know what that's about, guys, but Michigan State is well represented here this evening. At Michigan State, Julie had appointments in both the Department of Psychology and the Department of Integrative Biology, served as chair of psychology from 2010 through 2017. And then, and this is how I knew Julie, she was associate provost for faculty and academic staff development at MSU before wisely coming to the East Coast in 2019 to come to UConn. So welcome to all of our panelists, and we are enormously pleased that you are here. I just now want to take a slight step to the side to advertise essentially a collective bargaining project that the National Center is undergoing and that has dovetails with the National Academies project, and would like to encourage your participation. One of the areas of discussion in the National Academies report is the fact that many, if not most, colleges and universities made career accommodations for faculty in response to the disruption caused by the pandemic. And the assumption of those university administrations were that those accommodations would be gender neutral and thus would be beneficial to both male and female faculty. And we're going to find out when we talk about the National Academies report that turns out not to have been the case, and that some of those allegedly gender neutral accommodations turn out to be harmful to female faculty. For institutions with a unionized faculty, such as my own, such as Rutgers, those accommodations were codified in MOUs or MOAs or in some kind of addendum to the collective bargaining agreement. And the National Center for the Study of Collective Bargaining has been taking those in, asking for them from various universities, and now have a collection that's over 200 MOUs strong and is analyzing them for content and similarity and that kind of thing. So my request is that if you are in the audience tonight and you're either an academic administrator or a union representative or a union official or a faculty member with an organized faculty, and you have access to those MOUs and you have not yet sent your MOUs to the National Center, could you please do that after this conference is over? Some of the accommodations that are most common and that turned out to be somewhat problematic are tenure clock extensions, right? You think that's a good thing. Doesn't turn out always to have been a good thing. The option to exclude teaching evaluations for the pandemic semesters, the option to defer a previously granted sabbatical, additional professional development to facilitate the sudden pivot to fully online teaching, which proved to be difficult for many women with caregiving responsibilities, right? So when we talk about the National Academies report, these sorts of accommodations will come up, and we would like to get as full a catalog as possible so that we can sort of track where those accommodations were made in the context of, in the future, the professional fortunes of female faculty going forward. How many of them took the tenure clock extensions? How much longer did it take them to get the promotion and thus the pay increase and thus the added status of the higher level and so forth. So this is a beautiful way, frankly, in which two institutions in which I'm heavily involved, the National Center for the Study of Collective Bargaining and the National Academy of Sciences, their work dovetails. And I'm so delighted that we are working together on these things. Okay, a couple of housekeeping notes before we really dig in. We would like for the session to be as interactive as possible, so please put your questions in the Q&A section and we will get to as many of them as possible after our speakers. And we are going to take a break at 7 and come back at 7:10. And this brings me back to teaching, my teaching days. The students were always anxious to know when we're going to take a break. So now it is but come back, let's come back at 7:10. So now it is my great pleasure to turn the virtual mic over to Maria Lund-Dahlberg, who will introduce us to the National Academy's report.
Thank you so much, Karen. Hello, my name is Maria Lund-Dahlberg. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a study director at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. I would like to offer a real deep thanks to Karen and to everybody here at the National Center for inviting us for this session, for helping us to organize what we do hope will be an interesting set of presentations and really engaged interactive discussion with you all today about the impact of COVID-19 on women in academia. Before I'm going to turn it over to a couple of sort of the true experts in this space, these two wonderful women who I had the pleasure of getting to know throughout the fall as we pulled together our National Academy's consensus report on this topic, I'd like to take just a couple of minutes to give a really brief overview about the National Academies for those of y'all who don't know who we are, as well as some of the work we've been doing in this space that really led to the genesis of this project. So NASM is a private, nonprofit, non-governmental organization. We were established to provide independent, objective advice, to inform policy with evidence, to spark progress and innovation, to confront challenging issues for the benefit of society. We have the informal and very humble tagline of advisors to the nation. We've been around since 1863, where we brought into being through a charter by that was signed into being by Abraham Lincoln. And we've expanded multiple times over the years. The National Academy conducts most of its work through 7 different program arms that span disciplines ranging from transportation to medicine to education to international science diplomacy. But we do have a strong focus, unsurprisingly, on the STEM disciplines. That is science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine. I work for one of these areas we call policy and global affairs. And I work particularly with 2 bodies within that arm, the Board on Higher Education and the Workforce, and the Committee on Women in Science, Engineering, and Medicine. So the Committee on Women, as we call it for short, has been, again, perhaps unsurprisingly, really focusing on work that impacts focuses on the impacts of policies on women in STEM, and includes projects that touch topics such as addressing sexual harassment, supporting recruitment, retention, and advancement of women in STEM, intersectionality and the experiences of women of color in STEM, the science of effective mentorship, among several others. I'm not going to go through and offer summaries of each of these reports. I do not have the time for that. We want to get on to the topic at hand. But I would like to talk about a few sort of cross-cutting important themes that appear in these reports as a baseline for our discussions tonight. So first, each of these reports really drives home the need for greater diversity, equity, inclusion in STEM in particular, and the opportunity costs that go along with homogeneous scientific enterprise. For example, research described in these reports indicates that more diverse teams generate more innovative solutions to problems, and productivity of collaborative science increases with gender diversity. Second, these reports clearly document how bias, discrimination, and harassment serve as major drivers of the underrepresentation of women in STEM, including at the leadership level, and how women from marginalized groups experience intensified and cumulative forms of bias and discrimination. Sometimes this bias and harassment is extreme and overt, but oftentimes it is happening below the waterline, as is maybe popularized by the iceberg metaphor in the sexual harassment report. I believe my colleague, Dr. Fraser Benya, had the honor of presenting on that to this conference a couple of years ago. This everyday gender harassment has a profoundly damaging effect on the careers of women. Third, while these reports aim to offer guidance and tools that can address these various issues, the reports are not focused on fixing the women, but are instead focused on how do we fix the systems. As such, we don't focus on driving change through modifying individuals' attitudes or beliefs, but more on changing deeply biased systems through the policy and culture change at an organizational level. The reports emphasize that system-wide change at organizations will require committed leadership that is engaged and sets examples and puts policies and resources in place. Those human and financial resources, including time and energy, that go beyond asking women, often women of color, to take on yet another unpaid, unrecognized, and often volunteer activity. Data collection, transparency, and accountability are necessary to understand the nature of the problem and to make sure that we are actually making progress. It's necessary to take an intersectional approach so that we can move beyond efforts that have historically primarily benefited white middle class, and white middle class women at R1 institutions. And we also need to think about new approaches to mentoring, teaching, and advising so that we can ensure success and retention in STEM. We know that being a good mentor takes education, and that effective mentorship will account for the identities of those involved, as well as the power dynamics that are going to be at play. Now, about a year ago, it became abundantly clear that although these reports were and are based in the best evidence available to the study committees who wrote them, they did not and could not take into account the impacts of the, at the time, emerging pandemic that was becoming all-encompassing on our workplaces. So the Committee on Women tasked our study committee with building on their existing reports, and one particular report that's called the Promising Practices Report. As a quick 2-minute primer, Promising Practices for Addressing the Underrepresentation of Women in STEM, which was released in February of 2020, documents decades of research showing that bias, discrimination, and harassment are major drivers of underrepresentation of women in science, engineering, and medicine. It shows that the underrepresentation of women varies by career stage and by discipline. In fields such as physics, engineering, computer science, the disparities in participation appear by the time students enter college. Whereas in fields like biology, medicine, chemistry, women are at or near, in some cases even above parity at the bachelor level, but encounter barriers and bias that prevent equal representation at the faculty level and block advancement into leadership positions. Additionally, women of color experience intensified forms of bias and discrimination in STEM, and as a result of the cumulative ways in which multiple forms of discrimination intersect. But the report also, the Promising Practices Report also documents a range of strategies and practices that were shown promise in improving the recruitment, retention, and advancement of women. And these include ways to write job descriptions, ways to mitigate the bias in interviews and evaluations for promotion, ways to expand networks of job candidates, and ways to think critically about what we value and what we reward. Now, we now know that the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated existing challenges and brought new challenges to the fore. And many of those particular tools or approaches that were laid out in the Promising Practices report were either not followed or could not be followed for many different reasons. We also know that it had and has the potential to highlight opportunities for catalytic change in our system. So to dig deeper into what our study committee found, I would like to welcome to the virtual mic two members of the committee who wrote the report. Committee Chair, Dr. Eve Higginbotham, and committee member, Dr. Leslie Gonzalez, who Karen gave a fabulous introduction to both of them. They will provide a quick overview of some of the highlights from our most recent report on the impact of COVID-19 on the careers of women in academic sciences, engineering, and medicine. And with that, I'm going to try and share my screen for y'all so that we can swap over. Eve?
Great. Thanks, Maria. Thanks for that wonderful introduction, Karen, and Maria for setting up our topic tonight. I'd like to thank you for having us come and join you for this conference and for this conversation tonight, and share with you the newest, one of the newest consensus studies from the National Academies, as you heard, the impact of COVID-19 on the careers of women in academic sciences, engineering, and medicine. As the chair of the committee, I had the wonderful opportunity to work with colleagues from across the country regarding this topic, and I'm joined, as you heard tonight, by Leslie Gonzalez. Next slide, please. And thanks, Maria, for advancing the slides. We want to begin by acknowledging that the focus of our statement of task, and indeed the focus of our report, is on the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic was not the only devastating event of 2020, as we all recognize, nor did it impact all women equally. During stressful times, those who are systematically disadvantaged are more likely to experience additional strain and instability than those who have the established reputation, a stable salary commitment, and power. Women of color, as a woman of color, I know how we can be affected more significantly than others, given the layering of gender bias and racism contributing to our career trajectories. This past year was both stressful, but also infused with hope, given the expanded conversations nationally related to structural racism. Next slide, please, Maria. This report builds on research that was well established before the COVID-19 pandemic. Before we present our findings, we will first discuss some of the information that we knew from before the pandemic, but it takes on a new meaning in light of everything that we just acknowledged in the previous slide that occurred in 2020. Maria mentioned the Promising Practices report. Women contribute to and benefit STEM, but they are underrepresented. We are underrepresented across many fields. There has been progress in some fields, barriers remain, particularly for women of color. Next slide, please. As we found in our report, the experiences of women of color, the experiences of women with childcare and other caregiving responsibilities, the experiences of contingent women faculty, all of these layered together to affect the productivity, work-life balance, and mental health and well-being of women in STEM. Next slide, please. Therefore, throughout the report and building on the approach taken in the Promising Practices Report released by the National Academies last year, the committee took an intentionally intersectional lens, which is defined here in this slide. This was particularly important because of the differences in how women of color were or may be affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. I have the honor of learning from and with a small, dedicated, and highly diverse and insightful team, including Leslie. They're all listed here, as you can see, geographically representing the entire United States. And we worked to identify and analyze disruptions experienced by women in STEM during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. In our report, we lay out 12 findings and 31 research questions, which predominantly aligned with the 5 major components of the report. So unlike other consensus studies, we didn't really have a lot of solid evidence to actually base any recommendations on. And it's for this reason that we launched these research questions. These 5 critical areas, I think you'll agree, captures the experience of women in STEM: academic productivity and institutional responses, work-life boundaries and gender divisions of labor, collaborations, networks, and role of professional organizations, academic leadership, critically important, and decision-making. And a cross-cutting theme, we'll all agree, I'm sure, mental health and well-being. We were not asked and do not make recommendations, as I stated, but rather provide summary findings that reflect what has been learned, a snapshot of our understanding at the end of 2020. These findings supported the research questions proposed in the report, given the preliminary evidence shared with us by the 5 commissioned papers that form the basis for much of our report. Next slide, please, Maria. Thank you. Today, we would like to focus on 3 major aspects of the report: academic productivity and institutional responses, gendered divisions of labor, and academic leadership and decision-making. We invite all of you to download the entire report, but time does not allow us to go through all of the dimensions of these 5 areas, but we will focus on these 3. Next slide, please. It is not an understatement to say that COVID-19 changed nearly everything last year, academic STEM included. Delayed experiments in individual laboratories, and even difficulty doing research that involved the community. Canceled global scientific conferences, as well as national conferences, critically important for anyone climbing the academic ladder. Shifted teaching and networking structures, altered publication rates, another critical factor when you're climbing the academic ladder. We also really want to emphasize as well the blurring of the boundaries between work and non-work. Indeed, there was an intensification of work that occurred, where you could have meetings that occurred on the weekends or in the middle of the night, something that you wouldn't necessarily experience in a pre-pandemic situation. Certainly, we're adaptable, we always are, but the disruptions caused by the pandemic endangered the engagement, experience, and retention of women in academic STEM. Next slide, please, Maria. COVID-19 has indeed blurred boundaries between various roles, and while remote work can facilitate the management of work and non-work roles, as mentioned, it also increases multitasking, interruptions, and work availability that may harm mental health and well-being. And that's not even considering the stress related with an uncertain internet connection when you're hosting Zoom meetings. Next slide, please. In fact, findings from the October survey of women in academic STEM conducted by Cossack, Allen, and Dumas for one of the commission papers that informed the report included questions about work effectiveness. As shown here, as you can see, with an N of 763, women reported increased workload, decreased productivity, changes in interactions, and difficulties from remote work. And now I have the pleasure of turning the podium over to Leslie. Leslie?
Thank you so much, Eve. Can folks hear me okay? Okay, thanks everyone for giving me that signal. So Eve has just laid out for us one of our major findings related to the changed conditions of work related to effectiveness. I'm going to start reviewing some initial measures of productivity and how those changed during the pandemic. As you can see on this slide, initial measures of productivity, such as publications, indicate a negative impact of the pandemic on the careers of women in academic STEM. With variations by discipline, women published fewer papers and received fewer citations of their work between March 2020 and December 2020, which may affect their job stability and future ability to obtain funding. Moreover, COVID-19 has exacerbated many stresses women in academia face under usual conditions. For example, we found that there are delays in obtaining clearance for conducting research during 2020, a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, leading researchers to experience increased burnout, sleep disturbances, poor appetite, and increased interpersonal problems and decreased motivation. Next slide, please, Maria. In addition to this, as you can see here on this slide, women experienced heightened physical isolation during COVID-19. Because women were underrepresented across most STEM fields, women are more likely to experience academic isolation, including limited access to mentors, sponsors, and role models that share their gender, racial, or ethnic identities. When coupled with physical isolation, this has an even greater impact on their well-being. Next slide, please, Maria. Thank you. In response to the changed working conditions and the stressors, post-secondary institutions and funders found themselves needing to respond. They were in uncharted territory during 2020 and responded in several ways. Tenure clocks were paused across the country, but these policies were often implemented without accounting for disparities in caregiving and job-related workloads faced by women faculty. Some of the approaches used by academic leaders, we found, to make decisions, govern, and be accountable were more gender inclusive and may help to eradicate growing equity gaps. Some campuses began to think about the long-term implications of the pandemic and suggested strategies to address this issue, such as revised strategic plans aimed at ameliorating equity gaps. However, budget cuts made by many colleges and universities in response to the economic constraints that arose during 2020 greatly affected contingent and non-tenured faculty members, positions that are disproportionately occupied by women and people of color. Many funders modified policies to allow researchers greater flexibility in 2020, but there was often limitations of funding over the long term. And while one-year extensions and flexibility are helpful, overall, there remain differential effects for women, and these solutions may not be sufficient. Next slide, please, Maria. The committee laid out 12 findings in the report, And for the next several slides, we will present 5 of them that are based on preliminary evidence from 2020 of the impacts of COVID-19 on women in academic STEM. When we looked at academic productivity, which is highlighted on this slide, we found that there were field-dependent differences in the impacts of COVID-19. Some disciplines, for example, like earth and space sciences, saw relatively consistent rates, publication rates for women, while other measures indicated larger negative impacts. How research is conducted may compound then the impacts. Next slide, please. In terms of institutional responses, we noted that many of the responses that institutions developed were not taken with an equity lens. What we mean by this is, for example, while colleges and universities have offered extensions for those on the tenure track, and while federal and private funders have offered extensions on funding and grants, these changes do not necessarily align with the needs expressed by women, such as the need for flexibility to contend with limited availability of caregiving and requests for a reduced workload, nor do they generally benefit women faculty who are not on the tenure track. In addition, the provision of institutional support may be sufficient if it does not account for the challenges faced by those with multiple marginalized identities. Next slide, please, Maria. We also found that relying on individual coping strategies instead of developing organizational level approaches may be insufficient to address the challenges presented by COVID-19, as well as those challenges that existed before, as you can see on this slide. Next slide, please, Maria. Here on this slide, we display findings concerning work-life boundaries and the gender division of labor. Our findings about work-life boundaries and the gender division of labor noted that the COVID-19 pandemic has intensified complications related to work-life boundaries that largely affect women. This increased workload, decreased productivity, changed interactions, caused difficulties from remote work. These issues are particularly salient for women who have caregiving responsibilities. And on to the next slide, please. When we take a quick look at the findings concerning academic leadership and decision-making, we found that many of the decisions that were made were done quickly and frequently deviated from effective practices in academic governance, such as those in crisis and equity-minded leadership. Fast decisions often impact positions that are held more by women and people of color, and the decisions made in 2020 have already had negative short-term effects and may portend long-term consequences. On to the next slide, please. As we mentioned earlier, we were not asked to make recommendations based on our findings, but rather to provide a set of research questions that can help guide future work, given the existence of only preliminary evidence at the time of the writing of the report. We recognize that it will take time to fully understand the wide-ranging consequences of the pandemic for the careers of women in academic STEM. We wanted to be sure, as we crafted the 31 questions in the report, that we provided questions that help us to more fully understand the impacts of the pandemic, but also to identify and grow into the opportunities that may help leaders and decision makers as they look for new ways to engage and move forward in creating a more equitable and inclusive higher education research system. The research questions, a few of which you can see highlighted on this slide, range from tackling remaining issues about the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on women's participation in STEM, particularly women of color, through how policies and practices such as extensions, one of the most popular institutional responses, may affect the short and long-term career trajectories of women. Other questions in the report explored challenges and insights gained from work-life management, especially for parents and other caregivers, or the changed nature of connectivity during conferencing. Additional questions probe models of leadership potential, institutional change, and how colleagues and universities can support their academic STEM workforce during and after societal stressor events like the COVID-19 pandemic. We can go ahead and go to the next slide, Maria. Here I'm going to highlight just a few questions concerning academic productivity and institutional responses. We had several questions in the report concerning this area of work. However, here I'm highlighting what adaptations did women use during the transition to online and hybrid teaching modes? How did these techniques and adaptations vary as a function of women's career stage or institutional characteristics, or both? What are examples of institutional changes implemented in response to the COVID-19 pandemic that have the potential to reduce systemic barriers to participation and advancement that have historically been faced by academic women in STEM, specifically women of color and other marginalized women in STEM? And I'll move on to the next slide. Here we have a few questions concerning work-life management, especially targeted for parents and caregivers. I won't read both of these questions for you, but I'll just highlight the second bullet point. How might insights gained about work-life boundaries during the COVID-19 pandemic inform how institutions develop and implement supportive resources, such as reduced workloads, such as on-site childcare, flexible working options? And on to the next slide. You'll see a few questions concerning academic leadership and decision-making. Again, you see two specific questions from the report. I'm going to read off the bottom one again. What are potential top-down structural changes in academia that can be implemented to mitigate the adverse effects of the COVID-19 pandemic or other disruptions? And on to the next slide. Now, we've just given you a high-level summary of the report and laid out just a few of the research questions. We hope that you dig into the report. There's a lot to be learned and a lot to think about for future work in the report. As the committee conducted their work, they noted two truths about the future. First, there will be future disruptions that will continue to test the system, and we won't necessarily see them coming. And second, to remain innovative and globally competitive, the future needs STEM, and therefore STEM needs women to more fully realize the promises of a diverse workforce. STEM needs women to survive and thrive as we move forward, in short. And on to the last slide. Again, we want to thank you, and there's so much more in the full report, which is available in one of the links that has been dropped. And we just are really thankful for your company this evening. Thank you.
So thanks very much, Leslie and Eve and Maria, all three of you. I want to throw it over. We have about 15 minutes before our break, and I want to throw it to Julie now, if she's still with us, if she didn't have a thunderstorm.
I did have a thunderstorm, but I'm still here.
Yay, okay.
Seems like it's passed through, so we're good.
That's excellent. That's excellent. We're controlling the weather now. I'm impressed. Okay. So Julie, you are an academic administrator now at a very high level. You're dean of the largest college at UConn, Arts and Sciences. And I'm interested in this, in your answer to this question, because I struggle with it myself. So we have the National Academy's report, which I've been through now a couple of times, and it's fantastic. It does not, however, make recommendations. Unlike some other consensus study reports, it raises a lot of questions, right? And we are only really at the beginning of understanding the impact, I think, of COVID on women's professional careers in academia. So it is May. This school year is coming to a close. We're all looking towards September. And I wonder what your thoughts are about how to deal with all this. Where do we go? Where do we go with the findings, the research questions? And let me just flesh out that question a little bit more. I worry about not only the short-term impact of COVID, but the longer-term impact of COVID, because people have short memories. I'm not worried about faculty who come up next year or even the year after. I'm worried about the new assistant professors who will come up for tenure, say in 4 years, 5 years, and have a productivity gap there perhaps. And I worry about all of our attention that we're giving right now to the impact of COVID on their productivity, you know, in the old-fashioned conservative sense. being criticized. So how do we protect against that, particularly since in academia, you can kill someone without leaving any fingerprints, right? So all of the above, Julie, take it away.
It's a giant question, Karen. So let me say, the report was incredibly helpful in terms of giving us things to think about, but you're exactly right. We are just at the beginning of trying to figure this all out. And I worry about these people too. I'll add one more challenge here is, you mentioned these relatively junior assistant professors. We have many of them who have they've been working for UConn for a year and have yet to move to Connecticut, right? And so, I mean, just think about all of the challenges there, not just with getting their work set up, but their lives and everything else, right? So I think, there are things that we and other institutions are starting to do, like allow for COVID impact statements in what we call our PTR files here, right? Tenure and promotion files. It's hard to know whether those are going to be really helpful or not, right? So on the one hand, you think, well, it gives people a chance to explain and it gives everyone the same chance, but is everyone going to feel the same way about taking that chance, right? And we're already getting questions from faculty, frankly, about, am I going to be viewed, and perhaps more from women than men, although that's just anecdotal, but am I going to be viewed more negatively if I write something than if I don't, right? So it remains to be seen how they're going to be used, whether, what they're, who's going to take advantage of them. I think what I'm seeing is, one of the most important things that I think we can do is really, and this is in the report, but I'll just emphasize it again, is active listening. Really listen to faculty and staff for that matter, but listen and try and understand what they need, and our graduate students as well, because every discipline is different. And I know we're focused on STEM today, but I'll tell you, I have 25 college departments in my college that range from the humanities to STEM disciplines. And we need to think about everybody across all of them. Non-tenure track faculty are going to have different needs, different career goals than tenure track faculty. Not every woman is going to be impacted like every other woman. So sitting down and really listening, we are trying hard to, we've spent a lot of time during this year finding mentors for faculty and running sessions on how to become good mentors and mentees. Because I think that's sort of that personal touch and that personal connection is really helpful, in finding networks so that it's not just assigning sort of a random, more senior mentor, but helping to really find the right people who can serve the different needs of different individuals. So let me stop there. Those are a few of our thoughts.
Okay, thank you, Julie. So lots of questions. We won't have the answers until a couple of years from now, I think. I have a question for all the panelists about how you affect culture change. It's another big question, right? So I let you all know in my introduction that I am involved in trying to affect culture change in the sexual harassment space in academia, right? It's another National Academies project. This is coming out of the 2018 NASEM report. So what I'm hearing with regard to the latest consensus study is that we need to try to affect a culture change in the current hard-charging academic culture that rewards the work first modality, taking from the gender division of labor chapter, and that pushes faculty and researchers and staff, and mostly women, to sort of hide the fact that they have care responsibilities, right? Pretend it's not happening. So I know that one of the secrets is leadership at the top, but if that leadership doesn't exist at your institution, how do you, two-part question, go about convincing the leadership that culture change is necessary? And how do you affect that culture change when all the rewards are geared to the hard-charging, traditionally masculine, work first sorts of ethic, and not towards the caregiver, reduced workload, and so forth? So I'm going to throw it out to Anyone on the panel who wants to take that first?
Well, I don't have an answer, but I'll start, which is we have a committee that's working here called the Future of Work Committee. And it consists of, there's faculty, the staff, there's administrators, there's it's a wide range of people. And they're tackling in part, I think, and I'm not on it, so I can't really speak for them, but they're tackling, you know, some things like, how do we learn from the good things that happened about remote work, right? And how do we continue that? And while minimizing the things that were particularly challenging. But I think they're also starting to discuss questions similar to this, that is, are we going to value all of the same things going forward, right? And is it more, should we consider the whole well-being of our employees rather than just what you were saying, which is just really pushing through to get the work done. And again, I don't have the answer, but I feel good that there's a conversation happening at least.
Great, great. Anyone from the Academy side want to take a stab at that?
I'll jump in. It's obviously hard to affect any real culture change without having leadership engage, but certainly there's a role for a grassroots effort to change culture. At Penn Medicine, we're racism, and we've engaged a number of people across the institution, over 5,000 people engaged in focus groups and committees. And that certainly creates an energy around any initiative, but you have to actually really have the support as well as the full engagement of leadership. It can be done. It's going to take a while. You have to look at your infrastructure for certain new things that need to happen, such as caregiving responsibilities. Why can't that be taken on as a significant institutional responsibility to ensure that there's adequate caregiving on campus for women and others who have caregiving responsibilities? So, as well as looking at your processes. So I think there are multiple levels. You have to have grassroots, but you have to have leadership at the top. And don't forget the importance of boards of institutions and having diversity there as well.
Okay, thank you, Eve. Anybody else on the panel want to take a stab at this?
So I don't think that there's a whole lot that I can add. I will note that a lot of what can be learned about culture change can be learned from before times as well. So the Promising Practices report lays out a really sort of, they laid out a really distinctive change process mechanism. And if you give me leave, I'll apparently not be able to share my screen easily because I'm in a weird mode right now. But the one that they came up with was it does have all of these drivers that we were talking about leadership, about having the rewards and recognition system in place. It also makes sure that there's accountability involved so that you know what is happening and when, and you can sort of take measures along the way. But the really important part is that it's iterative, so that even when you're trying something out, you know that, even you might get it wrong a little bit, you try it again, you loop it back in. And this is where sort of people who are champions for it, whether they're at the leadership level or whether they're at the grassroots level, can encourage that iterative process keeps going, keeps evaluating, keeps iterating and revising that policy over again. And that you continue to diagnose what's happening in your system. Now, I'll note that for some of this, that was made a lot easier during 2020, where the disruption of the pandemic and several other events allowed us to take advantage. We saw those abilities, the need to change fast and to put into place. I think the challenge that many of us will be facing is probably going to exist in the how do you maintain that iterative process? How do you intentionally move things forward? How do you implement, if it's not already there, the accountability mechanisms? I think there's probably not a lot of leaders out there who want to come out of this poorly. So convincing them that this is the right path forward is going to be the next thing as well.
Thanks, Maria. Leslie, before we go to break, do you want to add anything to the culture change problem?
Sure, I'll go ahead and add just a few points. When I think about fostering culture change, I always sort of place learning at the center of any change process. And given what we're talking about tonight, I'll give two examples of how learning, I think, is essential to foster change in the moment that we're in. Number one, as we think about the kinds of shifts that have taken place with regard to faculty evaluation, for example, Julie commented earlier on the adoption of impact statements that have become really popular across institutions. The learning that has to take place shouldn't just be on the faculty person that is writing the impact statement and learning how to articulate that for the committee. I would argue, more importantly, that the learning that has to take place is for the evaluation committees that are going to be receiving those documents. How do we engage faculty with what I call evaluative power to learn and unlearn their evaluative habits? How do we convince folks to center the amount of energy and time that has gone into caring for students, tweaking classes to go online, et cetera, advising and helping district doctoral advisees sort of shift their research agendas. These are the kinds of points of labor that we know fall most heavily to women, particularly in crisis contexts. A second point of learning that I think is especially important, and especially given our audience tonight, is we know from the literature that there is limited robust training for academic leaders. Academic leaders often step into these roles from a point of service, from a point of commitment, but oftentimes they may not have a sense of the many categories of workers that they will be having to care for and essentially make policy and decisions for. And one of the things that I've seen and that is documented in the literature, particularly in Adriana Kizar's gig economy, is we have so many categories of academic workers, and our academic leaders need to have a robust and a clear and nuanced understanding of those different academic workers. And when I say academic workers, I'm referring to the postdocs, the academic staff that have a lot of instructional responsibilities, sometimes research responsibilities, the non-tenure track faculty, the clinical faculty. There's so many different ways that we classify and categorize academic labor. And I think that it's really a critical point of learning for us to have academic leaders and leadership really think about those different categories of academic and staff as they step into those roles.
So thank you, Leslie, very much for those comments. And I want to go to break now, but I want to pick back up on a couple of them. First of all, we've been talking about care work sort of obliquely, referring to our homes, our own children, our own perhaps elder care requirements, but there's also care work involved in taking care of students and junior colleagues and so forth. So I want to talk about that care work and how that gets rewarded or not. I also want to start talking about the impact of the pandemic on non-tenure track faculty, adjunct faculty, contingent faculty of all types, as well as graduate students. We have a question in the Q&A box about the disparate impact on women in terms of layoffs, furloughs, and so forth. And I know, Leslie, I've heard you talk about this a couple of times, so I'm going to be asking you to start us off when we get back from break, if that's okay. Okay, so everyone, we have a 10-minute break. It's 7:03 on my machine, so let's come back in 10 minutes at 7:13. Thanks very much, everyone. I think we're back. Okay, we good? All right, we're going to continue the conversation. So Leslie, let me ask you to start. So we talked, I've heard you speak about the report a couple of times now, and I know that you speak very coherently about the impact on non-tenure track faculty, contingent faculty, adjuncts, and so forth. Could you talk a little bit about that? What the Academy Group found the impact was, and then I want to have a discussion about what is essentially the class structure of academic labor, right? Where at the top of the heap are the tenured and tenure track faculty, then the full, well, I'll create my own hierarchy from then the full-time non-tenure track faculty, then teaching assistants, graduate students, and then adjuncts who teach on a course-by-course basis. And budgets being, this will be a very long observation / question, budgets being what they are, it's usually a zero-sum game, right? If somebody gets a course release, somebody else has to pick it up. You might increase your adjunct numbers, you might add to the teaching load of a non-tenure track faculty member. So I'm going to ask Leslie to start off, and then everybody else on the panel jumping in about if you've thought about that. I think the impact's been exacerbated during the pandemic, and how we deal with that academic class structure going forward, which is, I think, of a lot of interest to those of us with collective bargaining in our universities as well. So a lot, Leslie, sorry, take it away.
Sure. So I'm going to go ahead and get started by talking a little bit about sort of the broader scope of the higher education workforce, which we don't necessarily touch on in the report. Then we'll go a bit narrower and we'll talk a little bit about some of the findings that Dr. Jefferson reported in their paper. And then I can elaborate on both points just a bit. So if we sort of zoom out and we think about the kinds of job losses that have been had over the last year and a half, the Chronicle is now reporting that there's about 650,000 net losses in the higher education workforce. Now that is including both folks that are on the academic side of the house, folks that are in the support side of the house, student services, groundskeeping, et cetera, et cetera. When we look at the larger literature on sort of how organizations cope with times of crisis, we know that folks that hold the most vulnerable positions in an organization are most likely to get cut first. And that applies in higher education as well. And so again, still zoomed out, we can look at the losses that have been had in higher education. And we know from some of the tracking that has started to take place that lots of those folks are part-time folks, folks that are contract employees, sort of contracted by other contract services that institutions partner with. We know that a lot of those folks are people of color and very often women of color. Now, if we zoom a little bit in, you can take a look at Dr. Jefferson and colleagues' paper in the report. And in their paper, they draw on some emerging research, largely from the reporters at the Chronicle of Higher Education. And I want to give a special shout out because they've been doing some good work there, and particularly Emma Pettit. And Dr. Jefferson also drew on an international study focused on postdocs. And what we learned from Dr. Jefferson and colleagues' summary is that as of July 2020 or so, there were about 220 plus institutions that had implemented some sort of employment action, which includes, a contract termination, a contract non-renewal, furloughs, and actual layoffs. And so when we take a look into those 224 institutions, and again, Dr. Jefferson talks a bit about this in the report, we know that lots of those folks, again, are in those part-time contingent employment positions. Now, the Chronicles paper that Dr. Jefferson draws on doesn't necessarily disaggregate between academic and other kinds of staff. But again, it sort of shines a light on the disparities in employment action that institutions have made. In the study that Dr. Jefferson highlights, the one that is the international study of postdocs, she found she reported on that study that there was a significant amount of insecurity and anxiety amongst postdocs about their economic future, the fact that they had suddenly lost their positions, et cetera, et cetera. So sort of holding all of that in mind, when we take some of these sort of landscape statistics and then we dig into what we know about the academy and the structure, we know that women and women of color have most likely taken the biggest hits. And I saw that in the Q&A that Susan Romlow noted the layoffs that have happened at University of Akron, where even tenured faculty have been hit with terminations, layoffs, so on and so forth, which is sort of unprecedented, right? It's this sort of unprecedented thing that we're seeing with tenured faculty taking these kind of hits as well. I think what I want to point out is that anytime, or as we look forward and we try to remedy or remedy what has happened in terms of these layoffs, in terms of these job losses, we want to take a very, again, an intersectional and an equity forward approach. And this is me sort of talking in my role as like faculty advocate at Michigan State University. This is not something you'll find in the report, but I often, talk with academic leaders and ask them to look at their data. What does their data tell them when they're applying decisions? What are the demographics of folks that are sitting in the positions that will be affected by those different decisions, right? There was, this notion of the institutional responses and a lot of it being related to tenure clock extensions. That was on one hand, good, there were some shortfalls, but that applies to a very tiny portion of the professoriate. And it doesn't apply to, again, non-tenure track folks, adjuncts, folks that are holding all these other kinds of academic classifications. And we know that women of color occupy those least secure academic positions. We know it from research going back 20 years. We know it from Finkelstein's, latest landscape study in 2015. The numbers are there. We know that women's presence in the academy has increased, but it's increasing the most vulnerable of academic positions. So I think I'll just maybe start us off with that, kind of a little bit of a big picture and a few smaller points. And I look forward to hearing what others have to say.
Okay, thank you, Leslie, very much. Julie, Dean Julie, I'm gonna ask you for your thoughts along this line about the fact that we focus on the tenured and tenure track faculty most of all in these accommodations, and how can we do better going forward, and what impact has the pandemic had on the contingent faculty?
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated, right? I think one thing that we are doing here is providing an opportunity for non-tenure track faculty to wait a year before applying for a multi-year contract, which I think I hope is helpful, but it still seems small compared to what we're doing for tenure track faculty. The other thing, I mean, everything she said is exactly right. I think the other thing to think about is what happened in terms of the differential effects of the pandemic itself on these different populations of our workers. So if you think about it, faculty in the tenure track and tenured faculty have multiple components of their job. So they're certainly expected to do research and teach, and depending on their career stage, varying amounts of service. So research for a period of time was largely shut down. For some people, depending on the discipline and the nature of the research, they were able to bring it back. Some people who were lucky and, their research was hardly impacted at all if they didn't, by the pandemic itself. I'm talking about labs being shut down or travel restrictions. Of course, that would depend on what their home life and other life was. But if you think about the non-tenure track faculty who are primarily teaching, nearly their entire job shifted. It wasn't like they were, as awful as it was, forced to put a piece of it on hold. They had to do all of it differently, right? And so I think, it would depend on the individual, but my sense is that the workload increased dramatically for tenure track faculty in ways, non-tenure track faculty in ways that it may not have for tenure track faculty. And be sure, I'm not trying to minimize the impact on anybody, but I think we have to really think about these differences. So there are effects going forward because of the financial struggles that we are all having. But I think there were also real impacts that were differential in the past year or year and a half on the different kinds of workers.
Right. Thank you, Julie. Eve, would you like to jump in here? And then Maria, I'm gonna hit you last but not least. So be ready.
I would love to jump in, and certainly there are a number of things I'd like to highlight, but at least I'd like to really emphasize that equal is not necessarily equitable. And so in the report, we talk about equitable-minded leadership. And that's a key factor going forward if we're going to make a difference. Leslie noted the importance of data and demographics. So if you don't actually look at your data through an equity lens, particularly looking at the array of individuals that are impacted by policy, then you're never going to actually understand what your ultimate impact is going to be. So that's where the issue of class comes in, as you noted in your introductory remarks. And it's important for us to put a spotlight on the fact that a lot of women are on these adjunct faculty, in these adjunct faculty roles, to recognize that that is not good institutionally or even academically at large. And we really can't go forward as a society with these kind of trends occurring. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. And another thing that I'll note is the tenure clock. Certainly a lot of institutions, again, going back to this equity-minded leadership mindset, if you will, a lot of institutions extended the tenure clock. Well, we know from pre-pandemic data that more men in institutions oftentimes benefited from tenure clock extensions than women. And it's oftentimes, it could be just as simple as taking the time to resubmit some of the papers that they had rejected from journals, using their time in a more productive way academically, as opposed to women who are actually in caregiving roles, either for young children or elderly parents, whatever their caregiving role, their roles are actually not proportional to what men are actually doing. As you noted in your introductory remark, where men feel that they were contributing, but only about 3 or 4% of women felt that they were. So the tenure clock extension is not the policy that we need going forward, but we need to understand what we can learn from pre-pandemic experiences and make the adjustments accordingly. Maybe it's an impact statement, as Julie mentioned. How did COVID impact you? How many papers were you working on? What do you have in your pipeline? And give us a sense of your attempts to get these things published as perhaps another bit of evidence that you were trying to be academically productive, but there may be other pieces of information needed to ensure that there is a more equitable platform for judging who gets promoted and who does not. So these are some of the questions going forward that we are asking institutions to lean into so that we're not in a position in another 5 years where we have greater inequity as opposed to less inequity. And we're losing women at the lowest levels of their careers, like postdocs and assistant professors, but also adjunct professors who may have actually translated into full-time faculty later on, but we're losing them in the pipeline.
Thanks. Thank you, Eve. Maria, would you like to add something?
I mean, I won't even attempt to add on to these great thoughts of in terms of what's being done right now, what is brought from the report. I mean, I think we all understand that it's a extremely thorny bucket to try and wiggle through. I know that, you know, we say in the report that post-secondary institutions found themselves also in uncharted territory. I mean, we know that a lot of people made decisions quickly. Sometimes when you make decisions quickly, and I think the evidence holds this up, is you don't necessarily make decisions equitably or intentionally. You make the decision because you need to make the decision. And what we are trying, I think, with the questions that laid out in the report is to, and Eve really got to this, was, you know, try to mitigate the fallout, the potential fallout from those fast decisions, from that responsive reactionary period. And the sooner that we can get our hands on that, I think the better we'll off will be. I am gonna note, Karen, you mentioned that I'm constantly seem to be working on new projects, and I just launched another project where we really are digging into how did promotion, advancement, the tenure, hiring, how did those things, how have they been altered by our experiences over the past 18 months? Yes, the COVID-19 pandemic, but everything else that we've gone through, including the economic constraints that all of our institutions have been facing and underneath, the conversations about race that are finally being held blatantly and openly, or at least in some places. And the many, many other elements that have been sort of highlighted both in the Women in COVID report, but elsewhere as well. And so I'm going to self-promote here, and I in the chat I'm going to add this link as well to this new project that just got launched this past week. It's not going to be a consensus study, so again, there won't be recommendations, but there will be hopefully a more broader understanding about what happened, what worked, what are people trying out, and what are the questions that we're still trying to dig into so that we don't slip backwards.
That is just terrific, Maria. And you had mentioned that a little bit before, so I'm glad that you mentioned it to the broader audience. So I'm going to pivot a little bit now and talk about a slightly different, but not very different subject, which is the care work that women faculty traditionally have done for students, right? So how does, and again, I'm thinking about the institutions going forward come September when we're all back normal, in, you know, big quotes. So how do we, trying to be smarter going forward, mitigate the impact, the negative impact that has on women faculty of all, whether they're non-tenure track, they're tenure track, and so forth? What do we do about that? Because this has been a year where students have needed tremendous amounts of support in all sorts of ways. And the George Floyd murder going forward was so upsetting for so many of us, and that just added to their need for lots of special TLC. So I'm going to ask all of you, how do we think about that, and how do we, I don't want to say protect women faculty from that, but how do we make sure that that's that the burden they bear is recognized in promotion and tenure, in merit salary increases, in all the other status pieces of we're all at research institutions, of our research institutions. How do we deal with that? So who shall I pick on first now? We'll go around again. Okay, Eve, you got it.
Well, this is one of my favorite topics, mentorship and sponsorship, and just how it isn't as valued as it should be in promotion and evaluation, as well as any type of incentive. And it is a labor of love for many of us in academia. And I'm going to actually maybe say something controversial, and that is largely it's women who take on these roles oftentimes, because there is this opportunity to give back and to actually connect with students. And so, borrowing from our last topic, moving it into this, is we have to actually ask institutions, and again, it's just as for me, not the report, but we just have to ask institutions to value those functions, those activities that really have not been traditionally valued to date that need to be, because we have a student body that has been isolated for an entire year. And so mentorship is extremely important, more so now, as well as sponsorship to help these students accelerate their entry into the field that they're entering into or thinking about entering into. We have to actually have more energy going the other way and pulling them to us in the process. And so it's going to actually happen where we as mentors and sponsors are going to be doing it anyway. But institutions need to recognize that this is a valued activity that will be rewarded and recognized.
So does that, I'm gonna move to Julie next, but one of the things I deal with a lot are the promotion and tenure regulations, right? Because some of them are negotiable, some pieces are not. You know, when we tweak it, we usually have to share it with the union. So do you think, Eve, I'll start with you, Eve, do you think that we need to actually make an intentional change to promotion and tenure criteria in this regard?
I do believe that. I mean, so that would be one ask. And again, it's just me, not the report, that institutions need to look at not only mentorship and sponsorship, but in general, what has COVID what has been the impact of COVID on your research? You know, clearly, if you're a community-based participatory researcher, you were impacted. You couldn't do your research. That needs to be acknowledged. And I see Maria put the mentorship report from the National Academies in the chat box. I was a reviewer for that report, so I was intentionally putting that, or maybe unintentionally putting that forward. Thank you, Maria.
I think I put it only to panelists. Let me fix that. I hit the wrong button. But yes, this is a recommendation that came from one of the reports that we worked on that focused on mentorship. And we explicitly did say, you need to include this in your reward system, in your advancement system, in your promotion system. And then we gave you ways that you could do it, right? It's letters from your mentees. It's, you know, correlating how many people in your lab are co-authors. How are you engaging in this process? Have you taken your training? Have you done other aspects? There are so many different ways that you can evaluate and you can incorporate this into the system. I'll note that, we're not, it's being done. People are altering their promotion and advancement system. I have not looked at the new University of Indiana system that just got announced in depth, so I'm not going to comment on it. But right, they just incorporated diversity, equity, inclusion work as a path, as an element in their tenure and promotion. And I think if you want to talk about potential culture change mechanisms, I think that's a pretty good one.
Maria, I don't know if you're planning on doing this in your new tenure and promotion project, but I think just the National Academy's reports that I'm aware of have pieces about how you could help change things by putting this in your P&T process and putting that in it. So you should just do a template of this is what the ideal process looks like, right? This is best practices, right? So
I don't know if that's out there yet. And I mean, we haven't done a consensus study that digs into what promotion advancement, what would be ideally engaged in that process. But I do know that across our reports, we talk about both the reward system being a barrier that needs to be overcome and being a lever or being a mechanism that could be engaged to help promote culture change or help promote a particular element of the enterprise.
I look forward to your next report. All right, Julie, can you talk about from your perspective of the care work, of students and how we can make this more equitable and not a punishment to the women faculty who do it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I agree, it's incredibly important. I think the promotion and tenure process is an important place to make a change. I think merit salary increase is another place that we can reward it there. And I would say, I agree completely with what everybody said, and I think we need to help educate our faculty about how to describe these things and where to put them, whether it's in a merit request or or the promotion and tenure file. And it could go in different places, right? A lot of our forms don't have a mentoring section, but so find a place in teaching or in service or in research. It actually could, for a graduate student, it could probably fit under all of the above, right? But I also think we need to educate our department heads, department chairs about how they can help their faculty do this and how they and their department promotion and tenure committees can really evaluate the information. And that message, so it has to come from sort of mentorship on how to do this, right? But I think also the leadership, deans, provosts, we also need to be sending the message down that we value this and we expect to see it.
Okay, thanks. Leslie, please. Oh, Maria, did you want to say something?
No,
You good?
I'll go ahead and comment on this topic, thinking about non-tenure string faculty. So I know that this varies from institution to institution and varies even more so in institutions where there's a union presence. But in some institutions, including my own, under some cases, there are clinical faculty or non-tenure string faculty that are precluded from serving formally on dissertation committees or, in sort of advisory roles to doctoral students, for example. And yet, these faculty do sometimes provide informal, right, not formally recognized support and development to graduate students. And so I think one of the ways, again, sort of foregrounding equity is what can be done in the context of an institution and department to think about how to recognize or change those bylaws so that faculty that are not tenure stream but are doing that work have the ability to be recognized for that work and to be eventually hopefully promoted for that work if there's a ladder to promotion in that institution. And this is extremely important. I'm thinking about, we know from the research that faculty are have particularly heavy presence in regional universities or what we call broad access institutions, right? And we know that broad access institutions are increasingly offering graduate education. So if you sort of think about all those forces coming together, there's an opportunity to really think about equity and foreground it in evaluation, promotion policies that are targeting non-tenure stream folks in an institution.
So Leslie, thanks for that. Maria, did you want to hop on before I
I do, and I love this topic. Of course, this is like one of my near and dear. It's like marriage of two of my great loves: promotion, tenure, and advancement, and mentorship and sponsorship. So I could live here for hours. But there are two things that I'd like to bring up. One that builds directly on what Leslie just said, and that is there is data out there that shows that this isn't just about inequity in terms of looking at the faculty development, but also inequity in looking at the support that is available in student body as well, right? So if you look at who students reach out to be their mentors, students of color are more likely to reach out to staff, and white students are more likely to reach out to professors. So you get this sort of amplification effect again and again in terms of what are the experiences, what are the exposure points, what are the conversations that are being had, what are the sponsorship opportunities that these students are being had as well. But the other thing that I wanted to bring up, and this was what I nearly jumped in to say earlier, was I think we also have to shift some of the language in this space away from saying that these are burdens. I know that this does take a lot of time, it takes effort, but I think that the more that we talk about this being such an onerous task to take on that nobody wants to handle, or that you don't get any reward out of it for doing, I think the worse it's going to be perceived when somebody does take it on, the more likely, unfortunately, the way that we are culturalized, for it to be feminized as a task. And so I think that there is a benefit to looking at these as, this is a great opportunity to engage with your students, and your institution will support you in that, hopefully, if things get changed correctly and we start to recognize this properly, but the conversation around this as being purely a detriment to somebody rather than also being an enhancing and uplifting potentially experience as the mentor, as the teacher, as the advisor, as the sponsor.
Yeah, I think those are all good comments. So I want to shift a little bit now to graduate students, and for Eve, do I need to include interns and residents there? I don't know, you'll tell me. Okay. So did you all find that the impact of the pandemic on graduate students, interns, residents, postdocs was also gendered in addition to the impact on faculty? What was sort of the lay of the land where graduate students and postdocs and interns and residents were concerned? Eve, I'm going to start with you.
I'm trying to recall specifically. Leslie did note the postdoctoral students as one vulnerable population. Certainly interns and residents, health staff carry the burden of the COVID pandemic on the medical front. And certainly burnout has been an issue, loss of opportunities in the surgical fields to have access to doing procedures. So, and that's compounded, right? So we didn't really have any specific information related to house staff beyond the mental health impact and the layering of the social stressors related to intersectionality, as well as higher clinical load, basically. But I would say that the connector is mental health, and mental health spilling over into physical health, and institutions needing to recognize that there needs to be an infrastructure for the care and well-being of everyone, particularly the youngest among the population, or those earliest in the pipeline, I'll say that, as opposed to just focusing on, the tenure clock people, or, there's a whole generation that we're at risk of losing just because of the challenges.
Thanks, Eve. Julie, you want to jump in here, and then Leslie, and then Maria?
Sure. I mean, I don't have any data to share, but I can tell you just anecdotally that, women graduate students in general seem to have a harder time because of all the reasons we're talking about, right? They're balancing care often of small children. And there are things that some of the men just didn't have to go through. So again, every individual is different. And certainly there are many men who struggled mightily with this situation. But I do think that, when our graduate students were struggling, and I think a lot of it had to do with when research was shut down and there was such anxiety over, can I ever get back to finish my dissertation? Or am I going to have to completely shift to something that I wasn't all that interested in? I think that's when we really need to make sure that they had the care that they needed. And that took extra time for the mentors, who again, then aren't as rewarded for what they were doing. So I think the problem is compounding, right?
Right, got it. Leslie, and then Maria, please.
I also don't have any sound empirical data to report on, but I do want to share an observation that I've made anecdotally. When I look at how our graduate students and postdocs on campus have coped with this pandemic, I do notice the same gendered patterns amongst graduate students and postdocs, in that there are often women in those grad student or postdoc positions that are organizing the care, checking in on others. I'm just thinking about one particular example that I saw repeat itself throughout the pandemic, where a woman of color sort of created, for lack of a better word, virtual coffee hours to sort of do checking in with cohort mates frequently. And I saw that, again, frequently. That doesn't come from the report. It's something that I just sort of observed. It's something that I think advisors then should also pay attention to in working with their postdocs and working with their grad students, checking in to see how they are checking in on others, and this sort of toll, to Eve's good point around the mental health, the mental toll that the pandemic has taken on folks, particularly with an eye towards those gendered effects. I do think that would be a really important research undertaking maybe in the future.
Thanks, Leslie. Maria.
Yeah, so we didn't really look deeply into this population in this report. We touched on them briefly in several areas, and I think Eve and Leslie have both commented on that. We did do a different project. I note that for the first time in my career since I left academia, left experimental physics, I'm back into an experimental field, in that I study higher education policy, and everything was happening very quickly. So over the course of the fall, we held a set of webinar conversations around the impact of COVID-19 on undergraduate and graduate students. In particular, we didn't look at gender as a differentiator, but we did look across a wide variety of institution types. And we actually invited a lot of people who had received rapid grants from the NSF to present on some of their findings. And many of them found, some pretty significant mental health impacts and the start of the pandemic, as could be expected. We had a panel of students come and talk about, how they were impacted directly, and there's some pretty heartbreaking, but also inspiring, which I think is probably my phrase to describe my experience of 2020 work. So I can share the write-up with that as well, but it was an intense set of conversations to be held. And I think that there was a lot that was investigated in terms of what has been done across community colleges and across regional institutions and across R1s and their support services and their classroom adaptations. And I hope that some of those mechanisms that were put into place don't get lost, because I do feel like some of our students really need to be supported. And yes, Julie, it takes a lot more time often to get this done and get it done right in this environment.
So we have less than 10 minutes left, and I have so many questions left. So let me try to get a couple more. So Maria just keyed one of them, which is that so we are all on this panel, we're from Research One institutions. And one of the variables in the study is institution type, right? Sector type. Is there, if you're comfortable saying it, is there a sector that handled the gendered issues during COVID better than another sector? Or if you don't want to go that way, is there what can research institutions learn from practices that may exist at community colleges or smaller liberal arts colleges or regional universities and so forth, right? Is there anything institutions like, I'm from Rutgers, we have many people here from Michigan State, and we have Penn. What can we learn from what has been done in the other sectors? I have no idea if that's a good question or not, or if the study is.
If I might jump in, and this is again from my own experience. I formerly was a dean of a small institution, and what struck me, having been at other institutions by that time, such as University of Michigan, University of Illinois, and others, was that it was strongly mission focused, and faculty really had a high level of satisfaction and commitment to the institution. And I think that when you're in a larger institution, such as a research intensive institution, you lose that cohesiveness and connectedness that can keep you going when times are tough. So if there's anything that I would say that could be learned, is that there needs to be a strong articulation of mission, vision, and values from the leadership. And that's got to be the ultimate connector that keeps people going through times when, it's hard to even predict what the next day is going to bring.
That's great, Eve. Thanks.
I can jump in just for a second. Because UConn is interesting in that we have a main campus in Storrs, but we have multiple regional campuses. And so I was thinking about what Eve said. I mean, connection is really the key, and supporting each other. And I think she's absolutely right that we need to sort of remind ourselves of our values and our mission at this tough time. But one of the lessons that we learned well during this remote work is that we can connect across all of these regional campuses in ways that we could have before, but we just didn't.
Right.
And so one of the things I'm very hopeful about is that we will be able to continue those positive connections, both among the leaders, that sit in these different places, but also the faculty and their departments, and importantly, the students who can get connected. Because we had to, we connected them to services run out of Storrs, right? And now we have a unique opportunity, I think, to really think about how do we provide the same opportunities for students across all these campuses. Mm-hmm. And frankly, they're different kinds of students in these different places to some degree.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's great, Julie. Thanks. I'm going to let Maria go, and then Leslie, I'm going to wrap up with you.
And I promise I will actually make it short this time. Just to build on Julie's, I think one sector that has been doing that interconnectedness pretty well, and it depends, it varies, of course, as it always does, is the community camp colleges. They've been dealing with dispersed student bodies. They've been dealing with interconnected, if you have campus systems like the California community campuses, is a huge set of institutions, but they provide services across them. And I think that there was a lot of lessons that could be learned from them. I think it is disheartening to see that they are not doing as well economically through this time.
Thanks, Maria. Leslie.
Sure. So you mentioned, Karen, earlier how higher education in the US is sort of structured around all of these different markers of prestige, right? Our reward system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that has meant, I think, this is again my sort of analysis of it, that has meant that some of the most high status institutions have been really hesitant to engage in online or distance education. And so that meant that at the height of the pandemic, these institutions felt really beside themselves. Even at Michigan State, where we do have a lot of online presence, the institution itself hadn't sort of adopted, I guess, an image of itself as being an institution that provided online distant learning sort of education opportunities. On the other hand, we know that broad access colleges and universities, which include community colleges, like Maria just said, and institutions that typically admit at least 75% of their applicant pool. We know that these institutions have been early adopters of online and distance education. And so I'm not saying that the transition was smooth or perfect or whatnot, but they were more practiced in online and virtual sort of platforms. And I think that there are lessons to be learned from some of these regional colleges and universities, comprehensive universities that have been thinking about higher education in different ways in recognition that the student body, the majority of student body is no longer 18 to 24 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And higher ed has yet to catch up with that.
Right.
And so I think that there's lots to learn from these broad access institutions that have been accepting and enrolling and serving racially minoritized, working class, disabled students for their entire histories. And so, yeah, I do think there's lots of lessons to be learned. And one of them is probably sort of the acceptance and the sort of all of the good practice they have around online and virtual education. Again, it has not been perfect. It probably, again, fell inequitably to some folks, but I do think that there are lessons there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I look with sadness at my clock. It's 8 o'clock. I promised you all that you would turn into pumpkins quite safely at this time. So I'm going to wrap it up. I do want to give you all on the panel and those in the audience just a little commercial message. If you're interested in another COVID session on Wednesday, May 19th, day after tomorrow at noon to 1:15 Eastern time, there's a session on COVID-19 and racial equity in higher education, which will be very, very interesting. So I'm going to tune into that. You know what's coming next, panel. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. You guys are great. I would take this show on the road with you in a heartbeat. I think this was terrific. I have so many more things to talk to you about. I thank you very, very much. I think this was a great session, and I hope we'll work together again soon. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you,
Thank
Karen.
you, Karen. Take care.